The sky had been darkening all morning, though no one in the small town could ignore the sense of worry that hung in the air. Clouds rolled over the streets like heavy blankets, and the wind whispered through the trees with an unusual force. Local news stations were constantly updating the public, warning that Hurricane Milton was fast approaching and could bring severe flooding and dangerous winds. People were boarding up windows, stocking up on food, and preparing for the worst, but for some, preparing at home was not enough. Some lives depended on more than supplies. In the middle of the growing tension, a man walked briskly down the street, carrying a small bag of essentials. He was a man in his early 30s, tall, with a calm presence that seemed to reassure people even in chaos. Everyone in his neighborhood knew him as someone reliable, someone who would help without asking for anything in return. He had a steady job, lived modestly, and had no extraordinary wealth or influence, but he carried himself with quiet confidence. Today, though, his mind was not on the groceries or the sandbags he had picked up. His thoughts were on the hospital on the edge of town, on the patients and the staff who might not make it through the hurricane without help. The hospital was a large building, old in some places, but it had a staff that cared deeply about their patients. On a normal day, the hospital was busy, filled with the sounds of monitors beeping, nurses moving quickly, and patients resting or struggling. On days like this, though, it became a place of urgency and quiet panic. The ICU in particular was the focus of concern. Patients who were already critically ill were suddenly at risk of even greater danger if the storm knocked out power or if flooding reached the building. The man knew that the hospital had backup generators, but he also knew from experience that in hurricanes even the best preparation could fail. As he walked toward his car, he checked the news one more time. The weather reports were grim. Streets were beginning to flood in low-lying areas, and power outages were expected to hit any moment. Emergency services were already stretched thin, and he knew that many people would not be able to reach the hospital on their own. Something inside him tightened, a mix of concern and determination. He did not hesitate. Without thinking about his own safety, he made up his mind to go to the hospital to help in any way he could. Traffic was heavy as the first gusts of wind began to shake the trees along the main road. People were rushing to find shelter, but he navigated carefully, mindful of the debris that had already started to appear. Water from earlier rains was pooling in the streets, and he had to slow down repeatedly to avoid hydroplaning. Despite the danger, he felt a sense of clarity. This was not the time to hesitate. This was the time to act. By the time he arrived at the hospital, the storm had intensified. The wind howled and sheets of rain lashed against the windows. Inside, the staff were moving quickly, securing equipment, checking on patients, and trying to keep everything running as smoothly as possible. The ICU was particularly tense. Monitors beeped continuously. Nurses whispered instructions to one another, and patients lay still, some sedated, others barely conscious. Every second mattered, and the man could feel the weight of it pressing on him as he stepped through the doors. He was greeted by one of the senior nurses, who immediately recognized him. "Thank God you're here," she said, her voice strained but relieved. "We might need all the help we can get. Some of these patients are critical, and if the power goes out—" She did not finish the sentence, but he understood. In the ICU, every machine mattered, every minute mattered. Lives could be lost in moments. Without asking for instructions, he joined the staff, checking on the equipment, making sure IVs were secure, and moving quickly to stabilize patients who were in danger. He noticed that one patient's ventilator was acting up, another's heart monitor had started beeping erratically, and a third's medication pump needed constant attention. For the hospital staff, it was a race against time, and having an extra pair of calm, experienced hands made all the difference. As the hurricane raged outside, the man worked tirelessly. He adjusted the machines, comforted the frightened patients, and guided the nurses through the steps needed to ensure everyone stayed safe. He spoke softly, calmly, and with authority, which had a soothing effect on both staff and patients. Even under pressure, he found small moments to reassure the patients, telling them that help was here, that they were not alone. The sound of his voice cut through the storm, a small anchor of stability amid chaos. Hours passed, but the storm did not let up. Outside, the wind tore through the streets and water began to seep into areas that had never flooded before. Inside the hospital, the power flickered. Emergency generators kicked in, but some equipment still required careful manual operation. The man moved from patient to patient, adjusting dials, checking monitors, and giving instructions. He could feel the tension in the room, but he refused to let fear guide his actions. Each decision was deliberate, each action purposeful. Lives depended on it, and he did not falter. By mid-afternoon, the hospital had settled into a rhythm, but the storm was relentless. He had already worked for hours without rest or food, yet he did not stop. He took a moment to glance around the ICU, seeing the staff moving with coordinated efficiency, the patients stable for the moment, and the machines running steadily. A sense of quiet pride washed over him, not for himself, but for everyone who had stepped up. They were all in this together, facing the storm as a team. In the midst of the hurricane, there were small moments that reminded him of why he did what he did. A nurse thanked him quietly as he adjusted a patient's monitor. An elderly patient squeezed his hand and gave a faint, grateful smile. Even the youngest patient, barely conscious, responded to his calm presence. These moments, small as they were, reminded him that courage was not about fame or recognition. It was about showing up when it mattered most, about putting others' needs before your own. Outside, the storm showed no mercy. Trees were uprooted, streets flooded, and the sound of wind hitting the building was deafening. Inside, the ICU remained a fragile island of safety, held together by the determination and skill of the people within it. The man worked steadily, moving from one critical patient to the next, checking the integrity of equipment, guiding staff, and quietly taking care of details that no one else could attend to in the chaos. His actions were deliberate but instinctive, each decision guided by experience, compassion, and a fierce sense of responsibility. As the evening approached, he finally allowed himself a brief moment of rest. He sat down on a chair, soaking wet and exhausted, but his mind remained sharp. The patients were stable for now, but the storm had hours left to rage. He thought about his own life, about the choices that had brought him here, and about the countless people who depended on the staff and volunteers working alongside him. He realized that bravery was not always a sudden act of heroism. Sometimes it was the quiet, steady presence that refused to let fear win. Despite the fatigue, he rose and continued his work. Each patient he checked, each monitor he adjusted, and each nurse he guided was a small victory against the chaos outside. He moved with purpose, not seeking recognition, not seeking reward, but simply because it was the right thing to do. In that moment, the hurricane was more than a storm. It was a test of human resilience, courage, and compassion, and he was determined to meet it head-on. By the end of the night, the storm had reached its peak. The hospital had been battered, and many people outside were struggling with rising water and fallen trees, but inside the ICU, the patients were alive. The man looked around, feeling a mixture of relief and exhaustion. He had given everything he had, and the results were clear. 3 lives had been stabilized, and for now, the worst had been prevented. Though the storm was far from over, he allowed himself a quiet thought. Sometimes, the simplest acts of courage, showing up when others need you most, staying calm under pressure and refusing to give up, could make all the difference. And tonight he had done just that. The storm outside showed no sign of slowing down. Rain poured in sheets, pounding the streets and turning roads into rushing rivers. Trees bent under the force of the wind, and debris floated across flooded areas, making it almost impossible for anyone to move safely. Inside the hospital, the atmosphere was tense. Alarms beeped constantly, and nurses and doctors worked tirelessly to keep everything under control. The ICU, where some of the sickest patients were being treated, was the most critical area. If anything went wrong here, it could cost lives. The man had been working for hours without a proper break. His clothes were soaked, hair plastered to his forehead, and muscles aching from constant movement. But there was no time to rest. 3 ICU patients were in particularly critical condition. Each one needed constant attention, and with the storm threatening to knock out power or damage essential equipment, the situation was extremely dangerous. He knew he had to act fast and carefully. He first checked on the oldest patient, an elderly woman who had been battling pneumonia and heart complications. Her oxygen monitor was fluctuating dangerously. The machine beeped erratically, and the nurse at her side was panicked. The man quickly assessed the situation, adjusted the settings, and manually ensured the oxygen was flowing steadily. He spoke to the woman softly, telling her that she was going to be all right, that she wasn't alone. His calm voice seemed to ease her fear, even for just a moment, as she clutched the blanket around her shoulders. Next, He moved to a middle-aged man who had undergone major surgery a few days earlier. His blood pressure was unstable, and his IV lines were tangled in a way that could cause serious problems if not fixed immediately. The man worked carefully, untangling the lines, checking each connection, and ensuring that medications were flowing correctly. The patient groaned weakly, frightened by the beeping of the monitors, and the man held his hand for a few seconds, giving him a sense of comfort amidst the chaos. The third patient was younger, barely out of his 20s, suffering from severe complications after a car accident. He was sedated and hooked up to multiple machines, each vital to keeping him alive. The storm outside had caused a partial power outage in some areas of the hospital, and several machines required manual operation. The man checked each device, adjusted the settings, and coordinated with the staff to make sure everything continued to function. His hands moved quickly but carefully, guided by experience and a deep sense of responsibility. Time seemed to move strangely in the ICU. The storm outside raged with increasing intensity, but inside everything was a blur of action, focus, and determination. The man's mind worked quickly, analyzing every situation, anticipating potential problems, and giving instructions to the staff. Nurses moved beside him, following his lead, and even in the midst of fear and exhaustion, there was a sense of teamwork and trust. At one point, a sudden gust of wind shook the building, causing lights to flicker and alarms to blare. A nurse shouted that the oxygen supply to one of the patients was unstable. Without hesitation, the man rushed to the machine, checking the connections and adjusting the pressure manually. He felt the sweat dripping down his face, but he ignored it. There was no room for hesitation. Lives depended on every second of focused attention. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault. Floodwaters crept closer to the hospital, and the sound of wind and rain was almost deafening. But inside there was a strange calm amidst the chaos, led by the man's steady presence. He moved from patient to patient, making small adjustments that had huge consequences. He reminded the nurses to check the machines, reassured the terrified patients, and coordinated with doctors to ensure medications were administered on time. His experience and knowledge became the lifeline for everyone in the ICU. There were moments when the fear and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. At one point, he paused for just a few seconds, taking a deep breath and wiping his face. He thought about his own family, about his own home, and about how dangerous it was outside. But he quickly pushed those thoughts aside. This was not about him. This was about the people in front of him, each one fighting for their life, each one relying on him and the team around him. Courage, he realized, was not the absence of fear. It was acting despite it. The hours passed in a continuous rhythm of urgency and focus. The elderly woman's breathing stabilized. The middle-aged man's blood pressure improved, and the young patient's machines ran smoothly despite the partial power outage. Small victories kept the team moving, each success a reminder that their efforts were making a real difference. The man continued to move tirelessly, checking monitors, adjusting equipment, and reassuring staff and patients alike. At one point, the hospital's generator made a loud hum as it kicked in fully. It provided some relief, powering more of the essential machines and reducing the strain on manual systems. But even with the generator, the man knew the storm was not over. Every minute brought new challenges, new potential dangers, and he could not allow himself to become complacent. During a brief lull in the storm, he took a moment to speak with the staff. They were exhausted, but their faces showed determination. He reminded them that they were doing everything they could to protect their patients, that every action they took mattered. His words were not just instructions, they were encouragement, a morale boost in the middle of a terrifying situation. The staff nodded, inspired by his calm confidence and unwavering dedication. The three patients were at the center of his attention, but he also noticed the smaller details that could make a big difference. He checked the emergency kits, made sure medications were organized, and ensured that backup equipment was ready in case the storm worsened. Every detail mattered, and he refused to let anything slip through the cracks. As night fell, the storm reached its peak. The sound of rain pounding the roof and wind battering the walls was almost overwhelming. Yet in the ICU, there was a sense of order amid the chaos. The man continued to move tirelessly, keeping a close eye on the three critical patients, coordinating with nurses and doctors, and making sure that every precaution was taken. His focus was absolute, his dedication unwavering. The elderly woman looked at him and whispered a shaky, "Thank you," her eyes filled with gratitude and fear. The middle-aged man, now more stable, gave a faint smile, and the young patient's hand twitched slightly in response to the gentle pressure of his own. These small gestures reminded him of why he was here. It was not about recognition or praise. It was about making a real difference, about being the person someone could rely on when everything else seemed to be falling apart. Hours turned into what felt like an eternity, but finally, there were signs of hope. The 3 ICU patients were stable for the moment. The machines were running smoothly, the staff had settled into a rhythm, and the immediate danger from the storm seemed slightly less threatening. Exhausted, the man allowed himself a brief pause, taking a deep breath and looking around. Despite the chaos outside, despite the fear and exhaustion, he had made a difference. He had saved lives, and that knowledge gave him a quiet sense of fulfillment. Even as the storm continued to rage outside, he felt a strange calm. He knew there was still work to do, still challenges ahead, but in that moment he allowed himself to acknowledge the impact of his actions. He had helped 3 people survive the worst moments of their lives, and for that, he felt a deep sense of purpose. The storm had tested him, but it had also reminded him of the power of courage, compassion, and human determination. As he checked the patients one last time for the night, he made a silent promise to himself. No matter what happened, he would continue to act when others needed him most. Courage was not about waiting for perfect conditions. It was about stepping forward even when everything seemed against you. And tonight, in the middle of Hurricane Milton, he had done just that, proving that one person's determination could make all the difference in the world. The storm finally began to fade, though its effects were still visible everywhere. Streets were flooded, trees were uprooted, and debris littered the town. Homes had been damaged, and many families were trying to assess what they had lost. The hurricane had left a trail of destruction. But amidst the chaos, the hospital remained a place of quiet relief. Lives had been saved, and though the staff and volunteers were exhausted, there was a sense of accomplishment and gratitude that filled the air. The man had spent hours helping the ICU patients during the height of the hurricane, and now he was finally able to step back and take a moment to breathe. He was wet, dirty, and utterly exhausted, but his heart felt full. He walked slowly through the hospital corridors, checking on other patients and making sure that everyone was stable. Even though he had been focused mainly on the 3 most critical patients, he knew that the work of recovery was far from over. The hospital was still in chaos, and people everywhere were relying on the dedication of the staff to get through the aftermath. As he walked past one of the hospital rooms, he overheard a nurse talking quietly to a family member. The nurse described how a volunteer had worked tirelessly during the worst hours of the storm, ensuring that their loved ones survived. The man paused for a moment, listening without making himself known. He didn't want recognition. He had only acted out of instinct and a sense of duty, but hearing the gratitude in the nurse's voice made him feel a strange warmth. It was a reminder that even small acts of courage could leave a lasting impact. Outside the hospital, news crews began arriving, documenting the aftermath of Hurricane Milton. Streets were impassable for normal vehicles, and emergency teams were still working to rescue stranded families. When the man stepped outside for a brief break, a camera crew spotted him. Someone had seen him helping the patients and mentioned his actions to the press. The man shook his head, trying to avoid attention, but a reporter approached him with a microphone and a friendly smile. "We heard about what you did during the hurricane," the reporter said. "3 ICU patients survived because of your efforts. How do you feel about that?" The man took a deep breath, water dripping from his hair. "I just did what anyone else would do," he replied quietly. "People were in danger and I had to help. I didn't think about myself. I just wanted to make sure they were safe." The reporter nodded, clearly impressed, and captured a few more clips of him explaining his actions. The footage would later be broadcast on local news and shared widely on social media. People across the town, and even beyond, were inspired by the story of a man who had risked his own safety to save lives during one of the worst storms the area had ever seen. Inside the hospital, the families of the ICU patients began visiting, eager to see their loved ones and to thank the person who had saved them. The elderly woman's daughter held his hand tightly, tears streaming down her face. "You saved her life," she said. "I don't know how to thank you enough." The man shook his head and offered a small smile. "You don't need to thank me," he said. "I'm just glad she's going to be okay." The middle-aged man, now stable and recovering, managed a weak smile as he spoke. "I can't believe I'm alive because of you," he said. "I'll never forget this." The young patient, though still recovering, gave a faint thumbs up and tried to speak, his eyes filled with gratitude. The man felt a lump in his throat. These moments reminded him that courage was not about heroics in movies or headlines. It was about showing up, staying calm, and acting when it mattered most. As the day continued, more recognition began to pour in. Hospital staff shared stories of his tireless efforts, describing how he had coordinated with nurses, manually operated equipment, and reassured patients while the storm raged outside. They spoke of his calm presence, his quick thinking, and his willingness to put himself in danger for the sake of others. The man, however, remained humble, insisting that he had only done what anyone else would have done in his place. The story began to spread beyond the hospital. Local news stations interviewed staff and families, sharing the tale of the man who had become a quiet hero during Hurricane Milton. Social media posts went viral, with neighbors, friends, and strangers praising his courage and selflessness. Some people tried to reach out to him directly, sending messages of thanks and admiration. Despite the sudden attention, he remained grounded, focusing on the ongoing recovery efforts rather than the recognition. The impact of his actions went beyond the ICU. The hospital's other departments had also been affected by the storm, and seeing the man's dedication inspired others to work harder. Nurses, doctors, and volunteers felt renewed motivation, knowing that someone had faced the storm head-on to save lives. The sense of teamwork and community that had been fragile in the chaos of the hurricane was now stronger than ever. Amid all this, the man had a chance to reflect on what had happened. He thought about the storm itself, the power of nature, the destruction it caused, and the fragility of life. He also thought about the patients, the staff, and the families who depended on him. It was a lot to process, but he realized that moments like these revealed the best in people. Courage, compassion, and selflessness could shine even in the darkest times. The families of the patients continued to visit, sharing stories and expressing their gratitude. Each interaction reminded the man that his efforts had real, tangible effects. One mother told him how she had feared losing her child during the hurricane and how seeing him at the bedside had given her hope. Another family shared how they had worried about their loved one's life and how his calm guidance had made all the difference. Each story left an impression, reinforcing his belief that helping others was the most meaningful thing he could do. Meanwhile, the hospital began to assess the damage caused by the hurricane. Some areas were flooded, supplies had been lost, and repairs were urgently needed. The man stayed to help organize efforts, assist with moving patients safely, and support staff as they worked to restore order. Even after the ICU crisis was under control, his presence remained valuable. He had become a symbol of resilience, someone who had proven that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when faced with challenges. As evening approached, the man finally allowed himself a moment of rest. He found a quiet corner in the hospital, sat down, and took a deep breath. He was tired, exhausted in fact, but there was a sense of peace in knowing that his efforts had made a difference. Outside, the storm's remnants continued, but inside, life had returned to a fragile normalcy. Patients were stable, staff were organized, and the immediate danger had passed. Despite the fatigue, he found himself thinking about the future. The hurricane had shown him the power of community, the importance of courage, and the impact that one person could have. He realized that recognition, while not necessary for motivation, could inspire others to act similarly. Courage and kindness could be contagious, and stories of selflessness could encourage people to step up in times of need. The news footage began airing on local channels, and soon the man's actions were known throughout the town. People shared messages of appreciation, some even offering help, support, or small gifts. But he continued to deflect attention, emphasizing that the real heroes were the hospital staff, the volunteers, and the patients who had fought to survive. Still, the public's admiration grew. He had become an example of bravery, a real-life hero whose actions were grounded in compassion and responsibility. The next morning, the town began its full recovery efforts. Families worked to clear debris, repair homes, and check on neighbors. Emergency services continued to assist those in need. Throughout it all, the man returned to the hospital, helping where he could, supporting staff and checking on the 3 ICU patients who had been the focus of his efforts during the storm. They were now stable, recovering, and in some cases even able to smile and speak again. Seeing their improvement filled him with quiet joy, a reminder that the hours of struggle had been worth it. As he walked through the hospital halls, he noticed the staff talking about him quietly. They shared stories of his determination, his calm leadership, and his tireless work. Some joked about how he seemed almost superhuman in his focus, but everyone agreed on one thing: his courage had saved lives. Yet he remained humble, offering only a small smile and a quiet word of thanks to those who praised him. For him, the reward was in knowing that people had survived, that families could be together, and that the ICU patients had a second chance at life. By the end of the day, the man took a final walk around the hospital. He checked on the patients once more, ensured everything was in order, and then stepped outside. The streets were still flooded, but the sun was beginning to peek through the clouds. The storm's fury was subsiding, and the town was slowly emerging from the chaos. He paused for a moment, looking at the town he had always called home. The hurricane had caused destruction, but it had also revealed the strength, courage, and compassion within the community. He realized that his actions during the storm had changed more than just the lives of the ICU patients. They had inspired hope in the hospital staff, reassurance in the families, and admiration in the community. The ripple effect of a single person's courage was more powerful than he could have imagined. And though he did not seek recognition, he knew that the story of those critical hours would remain a symbol of bravery and humanity for a long time to come. 3 days had passed since Hurricane Milton had wreaked havoc on the town. The streets were slowly clearing of debris, the floodwaters were beginning to recede, and people were cautiously returning to their daily lives. The man had spent most of these days helping where he could, checking on neighbors, assisting hospital staff, and making sure that the 3 ICU patients he had saved were stable and recovering well. Though the physical storm had ended, the emotional and mental weight of those intense hours still lingered. He woke up one morning feeling exhausted but determined. His body ached from constant work over the past several days, but he couldn't allow himself to slow down completely. There were still people who needed help, and the aftermath of the hurricane was far from resolved. As he stepped outside his home, he noticed neighbors working together, clearing fallen trees, carrying waterlogged furniture to safer places, and checking on elderly residents. There was a sense of solidarity, a quiet bond formed by shared hardship. While walking to the hospital for his daily check-in, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, and for a moment he hesitated before answering. A calm, professional voice came through, introducing themselves as a local philanthropist who had seen the news coverage of his actions during the hurricane. The voice explained that they had been deeply moved by his bravery and dedication to helping the ICU patients, and that they wanted to meet him to discuss an opportunity. The man was initially skeptical. He had spent the past few days focused solely on helping others, not thinking about recognition, fame, or rewards. The idea that someone wealthy and influential would reach out to him seemed almost surreal. "I don't need anything," he replied, trying to politely decline. But the voice insisted that it was not about charity or handouts. It was about providing an opportunity to help him grow and to continue making a positive impact on the community. Curious and slightly intrigued, he agreed to meet the person later that day. He spent the morning as usual, checking on the 3 ICU patients, talking to the staff, and making small repairs around the hospital to help stabilize things further after the storm. The patients were showing improvement, their families were grateful, and the hospital was slowly regaining a sense of order. Still, the thought of a potential opportunity beyond his daily routine occupied his mind. When he arrived at the designated meeting place, a modest office downtown, he was greeted warmly. The philanthropist was a kind-looking individual, in their 50s, with a gentle but confident demeanor. They spoke directly about the impact of his actions during Hurricane Milton, describing how the town had been inspired by his courage and selflessness. They explained that they wanted to offer him a chance to pursue something larger, a role that could influence the community in a broader way, perhaps through hospital administration, community programs, or even an entrepreneurial venture aimed at helping others during crises. The man listened carefully. His first instinct was to decline again. He had spent his life working hard, focusing on helping others directly rather than through administrative or business roles. He worried that accepting help might feel like charity or that he was unworthy of such an opportunity. But the philanthropist was patient, explaining that this was not about giving him something for nothing. It was about recognizing his talent, courage, and dedication, and giving him the tools to help even more people in the future. They discussed ideas, possibilities, and potential projects. The man realized that this could be a chance to make a lasting difference, not just during a hurricane or emergency, but on a daily basis for anyone in need. He could train volunteers, improve hospital protocols, or even start programs to prepare the community for future disasters. For the first time, he saw that his efforts could have a ripple effect far beyond the ICU or his immediate neighborhood. After the meeting, he walked back home, his mind racing. The streets still showed signs of the hurricane's damage, but he noticed something new: hope. People were rebuilding, helping one another, and sharing stories of resilience. He thought about the families of the ICU patients and the gratitude in their eyes. He realized that the same sense of purpose and courage that had carried him through the storm could now carry him into a new chapter of life. Over the next few days, the man carefully considered the opportunity. He talked to his close friends and neighbors, seeking advice and perspective. Some encouraged him to accept, saying this was a chance to make an even bigger difference. Others simply reminded him that he deserved the recognition and support for the bravery he had shown. He reflected deeply, thinking about his values, his goals, and the impact he truly wanted to have on the world. Eventually, he made a decision. He would accept the offer not for personal gain, but to expand his ability to help others. He realized that this opportunity could allow him to create lasting change, not only for the people he directly assisted during the hurricane, but for the entire community. With a renewed sense of purpose, he contacted the philanthropist to confirm that he was ready to take the next steps. The process of transition began. He was introduced to mentors, given resources, and shown ways he could use his knowledge and experience to impact the hospital and community programs. He learned about funding opportunities, organizational management, and the potential to create programs that would train emergency responders and volunteers for future disasters. Every discussion, every training session was focused on one goal: helping people survive and thrive in the face of challenges. As he immersed himself in this new role, the man noticed subtle changes in his life. He was busier, yes, but he felt more fulfilled than ever before. His actions now had broader reach, and he could see the tangible effects of his efforts on a larger scale. People in the community began to recognize him not just as the man who had saved the ICU patients, but as a leader, a mentor, and an example of courage and compassion. His life was changing, and the transformation was both exciting and humbling. The 3 ICU patients he had saved continued to recover. They and their families stayed in touch, visiting him occasionally, bringing updates and expressing ongoing gratitude. Their stories reminded him why he had chosen this path, reinforcing his dedication and commitment. Their presence also grounded him, keeping him connected to the real-life impact of his work even as he moved into larger-scale projects. He began developing new programs, starting with emergency response training for volunteers. He worked closely with hospital staff to implement better disaster preparedness plans, ensuring that equipment, protocols, and personnel were ready for future crises. He also collaborated with local community leaders, schools, and organizations, spreading awareness about safety measures, first aid, and how to assist those in need during emergencies. The town started to notice the changes. People were inspired by his actions and the initiatives he was launching. Volunteers signed up for training programs. Families felt safer knowing someone was coordinating emergency preparedness, and hospital staff felt more supported than ever before. His efforts were creating a sense of security, hope, and community resilience that extended far beyond the initial impact of Hurricane Milton. Despite the attention and new responsibilities, the man remained humble. He continued to live modestly, interact personally with the people he helped, and stay connected to the patients and staff who had been part of his life before the hurricane. He knew that true leadership was not about recognition or status. It was about serving others, guiding them, and making a difference in their lives. One afternoon, as he walked through the hospital courtyard, he noticed a group of volunteers training under his guidance. He paused to watch them, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. These people had chosen to dedicate their time to helping others, inspired in part by his own actions during the hurricane. He realized that the ripple effect of courage and compassion was growing, and that one moment of bravery could lead to something much larger than he had ever imagined. By the end of the week, he had fully embraced his new role. He was organizing resources, mentoring volunteers, coordinating with hospital leadership, and planning programs that would benefit the community for years to come. Though he still remembered the fear and intensity of Hurricane Milton, he now saw that fear and challenge as part of a larger story, one in which he could actively shape outcomes, save lives, and inspire others to act with courage and compassion. 3 days after the hurricane, the man's life had changed forever, not because of wealth, fame, or recognition, but because he had acted selflessly in a moment of crisis, and that action had opened a door to greater opportunities. He had turned courage into purpose, bravery into leadership, and compassion into tangible change. What had begun as a single act of heroism during a hurricane had become the foundation for a life dedicated to helping others, shaping the community, and ensuring that people would be safer, stronger, and more prepared for whatever challenges might come their way. And so, the man who had once simply walked into the hospital to help 3 ICU patients now stood at the center of a movement, quietly leading, inspiring, and transforming lives. His story was not just about survival. It was about the power of selflessness, the impact of one person's actions, and the extraordinary possibilities that arise when courage meets opportunity. He had learned that real change often comes in unexpected ways, and that a single act of kindness and bravery can ripple outward to touch countless lives. Life had changed dramatically for the man since Hurricane Milton. What had begun as a single act of courage, helping 3 ICU patients during the storm, had transformed into something far greater. His days were now filled with new responsibilities, opportunities, and challenges. He no longer only focused on immediate emergencies. Instead, he worked to create systems, programs, and training that could make the community safer and stronger for everyone. Even with all the new work, he never forgot the people who had inspired him to act in the first place, the patients and their families. He regularly visited the 3 ICU patients who had been at the center of his efforts during the hurricane. The elderly woman, now much healthier, often smiled when she saw him and insisted on bringing small gifts of thanks. The middle-aged man, who had recovered from his surgery complications, greeted him warmly each time, sharing updates about his family and his progress. The young patient, once critically ill, had grown stronger and sometimes joked with him, trying to lighten the mood and show his gratitude in a small, personal way. These visits reminded the man that every effort he made had a real human impact. His work expanded quickly. He began organizing community programs for disaster preparedness, teaching people how to respond during emergencies, perform basic first aid, and care for those in critical need. Local hospitals and clinics joined his initiative, inspired by the way he had managed the ICU during the hurricane. Volunteers, inspired by his story, signed up to help. Young people, families, and even experienced professionals joined the training programs. He realized that the courage he had shown during the hurricane had ignited something bigger. It had inspired others to act, to care, and to take responsibility in difficult situations. Despite the demands of his growing responsibilities, he made it a point to stay humble. He lived simply, often walking through the neighborhoods he helped to see firsthand the impact of his programs. He spoke to residents, listened to their concerns, and worked with them to find practical solutions. People admired him not because he had fame or money, but because he was